Oh, and you're on mute.
Yes, you would not believe that I do this virtually every day, repeatedly. It's good to be among you. That's what I was trying to say. And it's especially good to see Reverend Anne and all that her presence signifies in this time. Just really happy. Um, I thought I knew how to do Zoom, and I do, but I've managed to put Zoom on top of my notes, and so I'll have a little difficulty, I think, seeing those notes. But we'll work with them. Um, I'm happy to be part of this series, and actually feel very excited that you have engaged with a book, uh, After Jesus Before Christianity, that seeks to reformulate how we do history and how we pay attention to the history of Christianity. I am snuggling in beside that book, um, uh, because I am paying attention to what, generally speaking, isn't there. And
Mm.
it and oh, I should also say that I invite you to I'll try to give pauses for questions, but if something comes up, bubbles up, please ask and use chat also. Yeah, I teach a course. I've taught it twice now, and I'm gonna go for it for a third time, which is called Acts of the Apostles to the End of the Earth. And in that course, which I'm very young in teaching, that's the only place I'm young, but I'm young in teaching it. Uh, I ask a basic question: how would we study Christianity had we not followed Cornelius to Rome and Paul to Rome, but the Ethiopian eunuch to Ethiopia? What difference would that make? And what would we need to know? What would we need to study? What kinds of resources would we need to use to think with the Ethiopian eunuch? And partially it's disruptive because the route the eunuch takes back to Ethiopia, except for that textual moment, is largely ignored in the construction of Western Christianity. I'll just put um, a little footnote here too, that in the construction of Western Christianity, how we come to understand the trajectories of Christianity, we also tend to leave out Eastern Christianity, and we also omit um, Asian Christianity, which actually predates any missionary movements. But tonight I'm just focusing on that Ethiopian eunuch and what he means and what he signifies for us of that, all that which has been left out of early Christianity. So I think I was surprised at how that I got very emotional actually in preparing this lecture. It touched some wounded spaces, and I recognize that as I'm working on a recuperative effort. You know, for those of us of African ancestry, um, not only was the African continent our earliest place of origin, not only was it demonized and stigmatized, but it was just so completely excluded from the necessary knowledge of humanity. And one of the most egregious places of exclusion is actually in the study, many aspects of the study of Christianity. And I know some of you went through the Thomas Oden book, uh, African, I've forgotten the title exactly, but the African contribution to Christianity. And he talks there mostly about theologians, early theologians, whereas this book that you've been working with is predates that kind of period, overlaps with it, but goes to a more primordial point. And that's kind of where I am. So what I'm going to do tonight with the Ethiopian eunuch, this thing that stirred something in me of the recuperative journey, what I'm going to do tonight is to demonstrate not details or pictures of early Christianity per se, but to show a larger picture of the geographical, historical, and imperial contexts in which Christianity emerged, really thinking that it was not just Rome, it was not just the Roman Empire that was the backdrop to early Christianity, but there were actually African empires as well. And to demonstrate that they are mentioned in the Bible, to show the connections to early Christianity, and to use some map work to indicate that this is not peripheral material, and that there is something about it, about its exclusion, that points to the way the colonial enterprise developed, the way the relationship between Europe and other parts of the world developed in a way that so centered Europe that other parts of the world became negligible and expendable for what we know of things Western. But it's particularly difficult because Christianity is our religion that sacralizes those exclusions, not just legitimizes them, but sacralizes them, and in so doing, desacralizes those who were excluded. So I'm thinking, I'm going to name some empires, which you might have heard thrown around the place, but they actually have biblical connections. I think of Nubia, for one. I think of the Meroitic period, which was a very extensive period. I'll come back to it a little later. And associated with the Meroitic period is the Kushite dynasty, the rule of the Kushites, which actually was very proximate to the time of Jesus, but also of Axem. I'm not going to focus so much on Axem because it's outside of our period, but I wanted to just share some things about Axem with you. Let's see. All right. The Kingdom of Axem. I'm excluding it because it flourished mostly from the 3rd to the 6th century, but I want to point this out. It overlapped with Constantine, who sort of ends the period that we're looking at. And this line especially, this one in red, 350 CE, that's 23 years after Constantine died. It was the first country, first kingdom to officially adopt Christianity outside of Rome. And you've got to ask yourself the question, why is that neglected? Why is that not important to the study of Christianity, early Christianity? And this point about it minting its own coinage, it's argued that it was the first state to actually print the cross on its coinage. So what was happening there? What was going on politically in that country? What was the connection between religion and politics and economics that you would have such a development? I think those are the things that I would point out when it flourished and its relationship to Christianity, just to highlight this what I regard as an egregious exclusion from the general knowledge of humankind. But I also want to connect, let's see if I'm doing this right, to connect, so I'm leaving behind Axem for a little bit, for now, because it really doesn't relate to our period, it's later. But I want to connect closer to our period, and I'm going broadly biblical because I want to show that Ethiopia, where the Axamite Empire was, Ethiopia, Eritrea, countries like that it was already significant in the Bible. No, it didn't have a good reputation in the Bible at all times. It's also, I didn't put this here, but it's also mentioned in Greek philosophy. It's mentioned amongst Greek historians, and it has a mixed reputation. A reputation of Ethiopians had a reputation of peoples to be feared, but also a reputation of peoples to be marveled at. And arguably, for in the interest of knowledge, one might think that whatever the reputation was, here is a kingdom, a group of persons, a nation, who should be more worthy of our notice than we have deemed it so far. So here I have just listed a very few places in the Bible where Ethiopia, often called Cush, is mentioned. Psalm 68:31, Numbers 12:1 is particularly spicy because Moses married a Cushite, someone from Africa, and his sister and brother Aaron and Miriam were not at all happy about it. We can't assume that it's a racial unhappiness. We only, even if that, but we've got to think, well, what were the cultural dynamics? What were the issues of cultural connection that and anxieties and fears that might have been attendant upon this disdain that Miriam and Aaron showed? So there are also, oops, I should not be there. There are also other places where Ethiopia is mentioned. One of the reasons we know that Ethiopia is called Cush, it's because the Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, actually translates Cush as Ethiopia. So we at least know that there was an association, a connection between Cush and Ethiopia, and that too needs to be explored religiously. So my last point here is that Ethiopia was interwoven in the consciousness of Israel, often as a people to be subdued by Yahweh. Ethiopia was consequential. So I'm gonna take a little jump because it's not only the Hebrew Bible, but it's our times. It's the times of the Jesus movement, the times of formation, the times of dispersion and spread. This is where I got back to my class. What if we followed the Ethiopian to the eunuch to Ethiopia rather than Cornelius? What would we encounter? My first suggestion is that it's a counterpoint to Cornelius. Now, I grew up, and John and Pastor Ann and Pastor Heather, those who have been trained formally in theology, and others who have just been interested, might have always heard that Cornelius was the very first Gentile who was converted to Christianity. At its simplest point, narrative sequence, the Ethiopian eunuch actually is converted before Cornelius. Yet the attention has gone to Cornelius for good reason too, because Paul ends up in Rome. The empire is important. But it's interesting, it's an interesting piece of history to ask, why was the Ethiopian eunuch so interested in the Jewish religion? Why would he have gone to Jerusalem? Was he just being an ambassador for Candace? Or did he have a personal interest in Israel? Where did he make contact with Israel, with the Jewish religion? The most commonsensical places he made contact in Ethiopia. So there was an African dimension to the Jewish diaspora is the easiest conclusion from that. But here he is, prepared by his interest to hear and learn something about Jesus. And when he meets Philip on the road, he is ready to hear, to understand what Philip is sharing with him about Jesus, and he becomes converted. Does he go to Rome after his conversion? Don't think so. He likely went back to Ethiopia. He had his job there, and he likely went back to Ethiopia. Now make a connection from this first century event. I have no idea until we have the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. What happened in Ethiopian Christianity after the eunuch returned to Ethiopia. But remember, Axem was a kingdom that subsumed what we now know as Ethiopia and Eritrea and other places. And Axem was the first, some people would put it this way, the first kingdom to make Christianity officially its religion. So there's a contestation between Cornelius and Axem. We've got to resolve that. You can't ignore it. You've got to resolve that. Because no, the issue that Africa is that Christianity is foreign to Africa, that is challengeable. And that's an important matter for people of African ancestry, that we can indigenize Christianity in our territories, in our territories of origin. So what happened between the Ethiopian eunuch and the Axamite Empire? Is he its progenitor? And this is a great picture I just wanted to share with you of Philip. I'm not sure whether it's art. It looks like art, and I like it, love it, because here are two men in deep conversation together. And that lovely looking chariot, that's the Ethiopian's chariot. That bespeaks a certain measure of affluence, a certain measure of wealth. That's not a primitive guy going back to some dark country. And that horse in that picture, somebody's imagination, I know depicting it, but they can't imagine it because he's Queen Candace's ambassador. So he's not traveling with a skinny horse. You build from the notion of Queen Candace's. I shouldn't slip over that. You have a Queen Candace, a woman as the queen. And so somebody can depict her ambassador as a man of wealth and consequence, even while being a eunuch. And I'm saying that I can't take it to an art history now, but as the art history continues, there is a move through Italy, especially, to paint the eunuch as very Black and on his knees, subjugating himself to a whitened, a bleached Philip. And that itself tells a story of transformation and neglect and diminution of a tradition. Remember, you can interrupt at any time. I'm going to try and get through this pretty quickly. So we have the Ethiopian eunuch going back to Ethiopia. I came across these two little treasure verses in Acts in the course of this course. It's a kind of detail that you don't pay attention to at all. But it's also the kind of detail that Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in giving map work for proto-feminism in biblical studies to find lives of women. One of the instructions was, one of the guidelines was, look for the minuscule. Look for the things that you would not normally pay attention to. So I'm moving from Ethiopia and I'm making a larger connection now, because what I'm not just establishing Ethiopia, I'm establishing Africa as part of early Christianity to be studied. I think you can read this. Paul is now in Acts chapter 27. I think this should be 28:11. Acts chapter 27, verse 6. He is bound and put on a ship for Rome. Now we all know that Paul went to Rome by ship. The other thing we all know is that Christianity spread by the grace of the Roman emperor and the technology of the Roman Empire in their tremendous roads that people traveled for trade, for movement of all kinds. What we don't pay much attention to is Paul's journeys by ship. And here we are, Paul is on an Alexandrian ship. Pay attention to this, it's just a little detail. He's on an Alexandrian ship. That means it's an Egyptian ship. That means it's coming from a cosmopolitan kind of world, a meeting place of many cultures. And that ship from Alexandria is bound for Italy. That's why Paul can be on it. I just want to get a picture of the scope of travel that was happening here. Bound for Italy. Sometimes you get the impression Paul did most of it, all of it on the road, the way it comes into popular imagination. But he actually was on this Alexandrian ship. And after his ship wrecks and he's in Malta and he has to leave Malta and continue on his journey, look again, it's a different ship. 3 months later, we set sail on a ship that had wintered, spent time at the island, another opportunity for multicultural contact. And it's an Alexandrian ship with the twin brothers at its figurehead. The twin brothers are Greek, but the ship is from it's an Alexandrian ship. It's not just coming from Alexandria. I would imagine here that it's licensed in Alexandria. Its home place is Alexandria. And at the Alexandrian ports, it picks up trade from all over Africa and anything that comes into Africa. The same way we think Christianity spread by word of mouth, we've got to think that people on those ships and in those multicultural places were talking about it too. Among all kinds of other things, that they were talking about it too, but it doesn't figure in our calculus. So Paul goes to Syracuse. This is the route to Rome, Rhegium and Puteoli. That's Acts 28, 14b. Acts 28 rather. When he gets to Puteoli, you know what happens there? It's another one of these little things, you know. He finds believers there already. Why? We know Paul started the church in Rome. Did he? Who else populates these believers that are in Puteoli that he fellowships with for a while before going on to Rome? I'm just bursting open places where new questions need to be asked, new explorations, new research need to be done that focuses not only on Rome, but on elsewhere. And I'm going to try and move through this next piece as quickly as possible because I do want your questions and comments. I'm just going to show these next two maps and I'm going to pause in case you have any thoughts or questions. Oh, yes. One of the things that is present in Acts 1 and verse 8, which has been regarded as a very rough map of how Acts is organized, starting in Jerusalem, then to Judea, then to Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. Acts ends with Paul in Rome. So you would think that Rome is the ends of the earth. I think there was something psychological in me choosing this map. Look where Rome is. I have certainly diminished its size in this map. It's not the end of the earth. You might regard it as the center of the earth, but somehow the conflation happens and you know Rome, certainly in my mind, you just think of Rome as the thing of everything. When you have a moment to put Rome together with the ends of the earth, and you realize that Rome is not the ends of the earth. Look at it, friends. It's not even the entirety of the earth, but it raises, so it looms so large in our notion of how Christianity happened, that we really have very little space for other places and things in our contemplations. And I will always think that from here on, that you can't really think about the culture, the ways, the rituals, the liturgies of early Christianity without seeing it as larger than Rome, and that the other cultures matter. I'm going to pause. Let me just do this one last time. And I'm going to mess myself up. Uh-oh. Just want to put in trade routes and great empires of the 1st century AD. I've been talking about Africa, but there's a Han Empire. The Han Empire was parallel to the Roman Empire. Look at these trade routes. Can you see them? Look at how they divide going down into India. You ever wonder how people thought Thomas got there? Look at them. Parthian Empire still exists. We don't hear about them. And they've got to be part of our early Christian imagination, helping to build it. You come down to the Kingdom of Abyssinia, I mentioned already the Kingdom of Meroe. They were there. And I think you might be hearing some of the frustration in my voice and the exasperation that we ever could have constructed such a huge intellectual knowledge base and have the gall to think that we could just ignore these other peoples. And then say that we have enough with which to understand early Christianity. What we get to understand is that there is such a narrow interest in how we talk about the history of Christianity that we have just ignored, excluded that which was not of some interest to our dominant interests. So I'm going to pause here and just stop a moment and see, does anyone have any reflection, any question? And especially questions, because I'm still new in this. I'm working on it, and there's still a lot to be known and a lot that I don't know. So questions are important to me.
Althea, if you wouldn't mind stopping the screen share just so we can see one another as we get into our dialogue.
Yeah.
We had one question come in at the very beginning of your presentation that you certainly covered, but maybe you want to add a little bit more. It's from Julie, and she asks, how did the Ethiopians come to know Jesus?
The first clue we have is the Ethiopian eunuch. And not knowing the rest is part of the lament of this presentation. I don't think it's just my ignorance that I don't know it. It's just not taught. It's just not taught. And African Christianity, like Asian Christianity, it begins with the missionary movement. And I think you had Montanist Christians in Asia from as early as the 2nd century CE. But we tend to think that those places were not Christianized until the West got to them. So I only know, at this point, I only know the Ethiopian eunuch. I think that there is something more to be known.
Rusty's got his hand raised.
Rusty.
Hi, Doctor. Dr. Tausig mentioned the Ethiopian eunuch in relation to the acceptance of being gay, of people who are homosexual being included into the community. And I guess that's another act of inclusion is that, and I'd read, and I wanted to check this out with you, I'd read that the term eunuch in the early in ancient times referred not only to physical eunuchs, but also to people who were homosexual, who were not like a man who is not attracted to a woman. So, and I don't know if this is not following your logic at all, but I was just curious about that. and your
it's an interesting intersection of race and sexuality, actually. And I do not make any confident statements about the eunuch's sexuality, just eunuch and eunuchs in general. That if castration diminished their sexual drive, I don't know that automatically meant that they became gay. A diminished sexual drive is going to be diminished whether you're gay or straight, and I would not doubt that there were eunuchs who were gay. I'm just not confident enough to say that eunuchs as a category were generally attributed to men. The popular way of thinking about them is that they were definitely trusted around women. But I think when you see the Ethiopian eunuch, he is a flag that points to other things, because being the ambassador for Queen Candace suggests that he wasn't just the harem boy. That there were other offices that he could hold. The other thing I want to point out too with the eunuch is in Matthew 19, where Jesus upholds people who have chosen to be eunuchs or eunuchs by birth as exemplary for the kingdom of God. And when you imagine them over and against, say, Levitical purity codes, then it seems that at least by the first century, possibly before, there was a disposition and attitude where persons that did not fit neatly into any category, some of us call them anomalous persons, were able to be part at least of the Jewish faith. And the image of Philip and the eunuch in that carriage together actually makes very clear something that is in the narrative, that Philip wasn't asking about his sexual qualifications, characteristics, or features before deciding that he could carry that good news with him. So I think I want to wrap that up, and I see Sandra's hand. I want to wrap that up just simply by saying, whatever his sexuality was, however anomalous he was, it very likely was not the most important thing to Philip in determining whether he could become a messenger, carrier, or whatever, evangelist. Sandra?
Hi, thanks very much. Really fascinating. You mentioned Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and I remember as an undergrad, like 30 years ago, studying in Manitoba, going as just a young student and listening to her and getting her to sign a book for me in memory of her, and just how fascinating that was. But as you were just answering Rusty's question there, I was thinking, because one of the bits in the book where I'm at the moment was talking about just kind of the androcentric nature of how we define what a human is. And so it was kind of identified as a male body, and even in terms of genitalia. So, the genitalia for a male was kind of out of the body, but for the female, it was kind of still inside the body and kind of hidden. And as he was talking about the eunuch, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because as I understand, a eunuch being kind of not quite be able to kind of identify through genitalia what this sex is, and then what you're just kind of making the connections, because this thing that we do with kind of bodies or gender in terms of that kind of, Fiorenza talks a lot about kind of the androcentric kind of interpretation of history, and how the male is kind of the standard by which all is judged. And kind of what I'm hearing you saying as well is it's also in terms of just different cultures or empires, like what is the standard by which things are kind of the norm, right? So we kind of have Rome, and that's kind of everything's kind of judged by that in terms of this, you know, I just think it's a fascinating connection there, what we would do about kind of nations or peoples, we do with gender as well. Just it's interesting to spot those connections.
That, yeah, I find what you're saying, what you're reaching for to be very, very fascinating, actually, because in a way you opened up something that was there in my calling him anomalous. That he wasn't a full man is one aspect of it, but that didn't seem to matter based on Roman standards of masculinity. He was not a full man. Yet that he could occupy an official position in another kingdom points to a different standard of sexuality and perhaps gender definitions functioning in that society. And that too is an avenue for exploration. And it was just adding there too that sexual practice and mores were also different in Egypt. So while we describe antiquity through the lens of Rome and its particular politics and interests in so many ways, there were other tableaus, other templates happening in antiquity at that time that we could stir up. Appreciate that. Thank you. Sal.
Althea, I'm not sure whether I'm getting lost in the hand raising and so on. But
well, let me say it's Sal, then you, Sue, and then Alex.
Okay.
Good, Althea. It's good to see you. I would the time frame that we're talking about with the eunuch, and what time frame are we talking about in those first 2 centuries, and then what direction did Christianity spread first? Did it spread through Europe or did it spread through Africa?
I actually don't think it was sequential. I suspect that it was multi-directional, and not sequential. So a kind of sequential prioritization, I think, could lead us to certain kinds of roadblocks, and it's just a matter of ignorance and a gap to be filled, that we don't have that picture of Christianity, because this piece that was synchronous with the developments in Rome, but might have had its own particular kinds of features and histories, it's just not part of our knowledge. But I do think they were all happening simultaneously with different outcomes.
What century are we talking about?
First century. First century, yeah, and more so in the 2nd century CE.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a good book that's not about race, called Holy Misogyny, which in the way it covers the history of gender in antiquity, gives a much wider picture than simply what was happening in the Roman Empire. And it too is worth studying. It just doesn't do Africa. So, Sue.
Yeah, the gender questions are interesting. I'm interested in the belief systems, because within the emergence of Christianity, there's a lot of reference back to the prophecy in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible, and the impact of Judaism and the belief systems and the various possibilities that emerged at that point. But what I'm wondering with what you brought in, which is fascinating, is did the Egyptians, did the African belief systems, do you feel that had a play in it? How does that factor in a similar, or is it a similar kind of way what had emerged in terms of the prophetic fulfillment of Jesus's mission and the sense that a Messiah was coming. Would that be different if we incorporated more of the African Ethiopian influence? And did that affect the choice of the books that became part of the so-called, Bible, the Testament that people rely on at this particular point in time?
My expectation, thank you for the question. So first of all, my expectation is that there would be difference. That the in this way, and I'm offering this with a sense of grave limitation. That the first thing is that Israel was not a scientific culture. That's the first thing I'm going to say. It was an oral culture, which doesn't mean it was an ignorant culture. It was an oral culture with oral ways of being in the world. And I think you got to get in touch with that orality to understand, to get closer to how they might have understood the meanings of their rituals, the efficacy of their rituals, and the construction of their belief systems. That's one aspect of it. You've touched almost a Pandora's box in what you've asked. And that could be a whole nother conversation at another time. But just to say too, that Christianity co-opted Israel's stories, Israel's practices, Israel's belief systems. And for those first 3 centuries, perhaps the first 4 centuries, Christians had to figure out how to differentiate themselves from the Jews, seeing that they were now saying that their stories is actually, the Jewish stories is now their stories, but you still have the Jews living there. How do you do that? That's another kind of negotiation. But it also means that that Christianity too could benefit from our knowing some of the practices of other cultures around them. See, I think we have inherited, in this mix, we have inherited Plato, we have inherited Aristotle, but we have lost the artists and we have lost the poets who bring us closer to a different kind of sensibility about how we operate in the world. And we in our time are also reading and interpreting Christianity through a scientific kind of lens, which I think separates us from other ways of knowing that could be named, other ways of understanding. So that's a very long, I think, and complicated way of saying, I think if we got back to some things, there are understandings that we would glean. And one of the prompts for me, one of the prods in this, I don't know if you've ever read Olaudah Equiana's autobiography, but it's championed as the first autobiography written by a former slave. So it goes back, I think, to the 19th century. Olaudah, I could write it in the chat so that you can see his name. That's the name of the person. And one of the things I mentioned it because one of the things he said, he was taken from Africa and made a slave in the Caribbean, in the West Indies as it was called then. And he came into contact with Christianity. Almost a throwaway comment in his autobiography is when he says something like, it's that, I'm now reading this history of the Jews and reading about them in their Bible, and I'm seeing my people's practices. I'm seeing myself in what they do, their laws, their rituals, the way they articulate, the way they narrate their histories. He's seeing himself. That says something, I think. So that it certainly has prodded me to ask more about the connection. So thank you. Alex.
In the book that we're reading, there are sections about these small communities and how we know them through like groups like Chloe's people, where they're taking kind of some cultural practices from living in the empire, like supper clubs, and constructing their communities around that in terms of rituals around a meal. If we don't have the texts or don't really know too much about early Christianity in Ethiopia, are there sort of cultural rituals that we know in the first 3 centuries that we might think of or imagine what the early Christianity there might represent? And in a way, is it somewhat similar to what's going around in the Mediterranean, or is it very much specific to just kind of the day in, day out cultural practices in that part of the world? And do we know it, or is that still being studied?
I don't know, to be honest. Where the contiguity is, I'm not sure of. I think I would guess, and it's an informed guess, that yes, there are contiguities. Part of my hesitation is that the Mediterranean still exists, and one of the things we could do is actually go to them to see how their cultural vestiges are working. Bruce Molina did some of that many years ago when he started doing a kind of cultural anthropology for the study of the scriptures. But I don't think he got as far as we could in day-to-day cultural life. My part of my what I call my informed guess is that I think the movements between people in that time were far greater, and there was cross-pollination of practice and the possibility of recognizing cultural practices in other people, even if they were not purely there. Where are those preserved? And I think we need to look more closely at anthropological work in Africa, but especially autoethnographic anthropological work in Africa, not just folks staring at them, but what their understanding of themselves, how they understand the passing of the baton from generation to generation. And to do that in connection with the Mediterranean world, it's a whole different kind of conversation you're talking about. And what it contests is that we've gotten it right by simply doing it from a Euromasculine point of view. Especially, I like to add an elite Euromasculine point of view, because I would hazard a guess that some of them European down-home folk will share cultural similarities with our folk that our Euromasculine scholars have disdained.
Thank you.
Okay, I will continue, I think. Yeah, so I'm back to the trade routes and the great empires, and what the kind of imagination I want to share with you is that we're not looking at 21st century world. We're not looking at 21st century United States with the kinds of cultural separations that we experience in this place. We're looking at movements of people, some more so than others. These routes were trade routes, but they were also the roots of nomadism. They were the roots of cultural contact. They were the routes along which stories traveled and which people got together in the tavern at night and chatted about what was what. It's not quite, it's not all kinds of efficiencies, but word got around. And I cannot but imagine that the words about Jesus were also traveling along these routes. So that's a kind of imagination, I think, that mobility, cultural contact, exchange of stories, exchange, a transformation of people's lives, whether Christian or otherwise, was happening in that time. Let's see, what do I have next? Now I have to come back. Do it again. Back to the Meroitic kingdom. So I've gone biblical a bit. I've done some cartographic work. Now I want to come back, return to the kingdoms to wrap up things and show not only proximities, but more work about contact. This is the Meroitic kingdom, 300 BCE to 350 CE. It's a later phase of rule by the Kushite kings, the royal descendants and peoples descended from the kinds of person that Moses married. The names of types of people who impacted the Israelite consciousness. It coincides, roughly speaking, with the end of the Greek Empire and the division of the Roman Empire. And I thought, the Meroitic kingdom, it's before Jesus, it's during Jesus, it's after Jesus, and it's before Christianity. So it is lodged right there in the period of time that we are talking about. And to your question, Alex, if we could discover something more about the cultures of these people, their rituals, their practices, their belief systems, would it help us to better understand the biblical material that we're reading? Not only their politics, but why do they tell their history the way they do? Why do they understand the battle between gods in the way that they do? Why do they have fasting? Why is it just an idiosyncratic thing that Israel did? Were there other cultures that were doing it? How broad can we get the knowledge? And even if it doesn't enhance anything more, at least we know. That's one part of it. At least we know. So it's right there in the Jesus to Christianity period, right there in the period of the Roman Empire. And interestingly, there was a student at Drew. She wasn't my student, but she was there at Drew, and she did her Master of Arts in Religion. Her thesis, and you should see her. She was really a fancy dresser. So you'd understand. Really a fancy dresser, colorful, decorated. And her thesis was on the impact of Egyptian fashion upon Roman fashion and the development of standards of modesty. And that in itself was an innovation in our world. But it's a kind of tag that says, how did they know how to build canals? How did they know how to treat drinking water? What was the exchange of knowledge that was happening at that time? And when I end up, there's something that I'll say it challenges. So there you have the Meroitic kingdom, and it is an African kingdom. But look at this. I'm dancing between kingdoms because to some extent I have to straighten out my own knowledge on this to some extent. But this is coming down the Nile. This is coming down the Nile, and I think this is the Kushites, the Meroitic, this white strand here. Look at what it covers, right next door to Libya, right next door to Chad. There is Eritrea, here is Ethiopia, here is the Sudan, and you've got this kingdom going. This is a much larger picture of the Nile, and I think what you have here, down in this corner, coming up to this corner is what you have along here. And then you got the blossoming of the Nile confluence there. But look at this. See this here? Senpacomius' monastery, Nag Hammadi down here. This is where you get the Nag Hammadi codices. Senpacomius' monastery is thought to be the very first monastery ever. Here it is right here in Africa. What does it mean in terms of the fabric of a culture to produce a certain kind of monasticism? But it's all right here where the Kushites were. And my last slide, again, I just had to go with the Silk Road. This part is even more clearly part of the Han Dynasty. And look at its connections going right here into the Jesus world. So I'm saying between this and this and this, the places of contact with the spread of early Christianity was much, much larger than our focus on Cornelius and Paul's ending in Rome allows us to study. And I would argue that in terms of the ends of the earth, Ethiopia was known as the ends of the earth in antiquity. That was the understanding from way back in the 8th century BCE. Ethiopia was the ends of the earth. Scientifically, they might not have been right, but it was certainly not the limitations of the Roman Empire. And so my case really is for inclusion. My case really is I said earlier that there was a certain amount of anguish that arose in me as I was preparing this. I think you can imagine what that anguish might be like. It's the anguish of a people who have suffered degradation and the sacralizing of degradation by simply declaring at a point in history that you're just not worth it. Your ancestors aren't worth it. And then you begin to study and to see that there is more to the story, and you need a chance to stir up your ancestors, to dig and find out who they are. How did they contribute to Christianity? How did they form Christianity? Are there precedents that we disdain today or that we have excluded today that come from them? You know, how much more capacious could Christianity be anywhere if we had this knowledge available to us? And if other peoples are part of our sacred history, the question for me is, what kind of template is that? And could we continue this mad rush to homogenization, especially racial and ethnic homogenization, that is Christianity today? Would we be invited to understand Christianity as a far more diverse, far more disparate, far more inclusive religion, had we not just stuck with Cornelius and the confines of Rome, but been allowed to see the big picture? So I'm making a case. I'm building the case, and I've practiced on you tonight. But I would like to know more, and I hope that there are generations to come that will continue this kind of study on the road to discovering the sacredness of that which was lost. So any questions? Any more questions? Any discussions?
Mark, see your hand.
Ah, Mark, yes.
Oh, you're on mute.
Mark, you're muted.
I think you can hear me now. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, Althea, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation that you had. My one question is, you've given us the ancient history of Christianity entering into Africa. Are there still traces of that ancient Christianity in Africa today? How does it relate to the Coptic church, for instance? Or are there other elements of Christianity that I'm not familiar with? Or if there aren't, what happened to it? And what has gone on since those early days up to the 19th century, the present, or wherever you want to take it?
Yeah, you're carrying me right to my edge, because my immediate response is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and that is the history that I need to learn. How did it start? What has it retained, knowingly retained of that's vestigious to an ancient time? And does it offer any kind of illumination to help us to a better understanding of Christianity and even Israel, the practices of Judaism that we have inherited? I actually know a little bit more about Judaism in Ethiopia than I do about Christianity in Ethiopia, and that's a strange thing. So, I am not very much help, and I think that's why I teach that course, because there's something to be known, and I wasn't taught it.
Yeah. Well, it'd be a fascinating topic to explore in greater depth, because I'm sure if it was there before, there has to be at least traces of it there now, and how it's entered into other local religions, perhaps. How's it bleeded out into the rest of African culture, perhaps, or whatever the case may be. It would be a fascinating study.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Elaine.
Yes, thank you, Althea. This has been really fascinating. I was just curious to know, I've just started reading the book that, for this class, and we've been talking about how really the focus of these early people was kind of survival, and there didn't seem to be much thought of an afterlife, or much talk about resurrection or heaven or salvation. Are there any geographic differences, for example, that of, like in the African centers where Christianity developed? Was there any? Did they take the belief in any kind of different direction?
Well, the closest sense, clearly, I'm going to say again, I don't know, but the closest sense I have to any sort of belief in an afterlife is in the notion of ancestors, which is not commensurate with resurrection as we understand it, but it certainly has an implicit resurrection narrative in it. I also think that in some forms of African mythology, there is, I'm struggling to remember. There's one particular one, I'm not doing a good job of remembering it right now, where there is a sense of a kind of afterlife, but it's not very clear. You see, we have historicized the narratives of the afterlife, so that if you don't believe in resurrection now, you're just not a good Christian. But to narrativize the notion of resurrection, which was present actually in the larger Greco-Roman atmosphere, to narrativize it was not about molecular reformations or anything like that. It was more about the way you shape a people's imagination for something that was greater, a sensibility about something greater than what you have in the present. But I think, and that's one of those things I think we would have to think about again if we saw those ideas in narrative form in other places versus our historicizing. It has to be real and actual in history for it to be true. So the contestations for truths are also at stake.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Thank
you. I did want to just and thank you very much for this. It's fascinating, and I really appreciate the map that you showed. I've always been really interested in the desert fathers and mothers who after Constantine broke off and went to form the monastic movement, and from my understanding is they went down into the deserts of that area around Ethiopia. And I thought it was fascinating that that's where the first monastery was, and also the Nag Hammadi writings are. And it's also struck me that the Orthodox traditions carry the monastic tradition more closely than Western Christianity. Yeah. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. So
I wonder too. No, I appreciate the observation. It awakens hungers in me. Because why there? What is there about a wilderness type life that conduces to a contemplative kind of existence? It's where John the Baptist went. It's where Jesus went. Where do we go to find that kind of understanding, given our present day aversion sort of to the wilderness experience, except as a high adventure for the highly adventurous? But yeah, it's that kind of questioning that it opens up for me.
Althea, I've had my hand up. I don't know.
No, I didn't see. I'm sorry, Heather. No, I haven't seen
that's
it.
okay. Yeah. That's why I kind of.
I'm looking for the mechanical.
I can't find that either.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that. So,
I don't either.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad I'm not the only one. But I kind of want to go back to the last statement that you made, Althea, when you were saying how different things would have been if we had gone with the Ethiopian and not And are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. And I wondered, and I kind of had, my thoughts were better before everybody else started talking again, and then I kind of lost it again.
And what you mean?
What would you envision, or do you have a vision of what the church would have been like or looked like had we gone in that other direction? Does that make a lot of sense?
Yeah, also in that direction rather than excluding it. I am attaching, my history is horrible, Reverend Heather, really very horrible. So I'm being very sketchy at this point, that there is a point at which the institutional formation of Christianity hardens alongside of emergent nationalism in Europe. And my dates are rough, but I that's one facet. I bring into it the Hegelian work because Hegel was very, very significant in terms of the schools of thought that he spawned. But core into Hegel's work was the dismissal, a very, very arrogant dismissal and depreciation of Asia and Africa, which became part of the thinking and teaching of Christianity. And there is a very interesting book by, I think his name is Sean Feeney, called The Racialization of Jesus. And Pastor Ann has a slideshow that is really, really very apropos to this issue and captures, I don't think she's quoting, she's citing, working from Sean Feeney, but she could be right alongside of him depicting what he's talking about, how Jesus became white, beginning, say, in medieval Europe times and coming into the USA is where he takes it, through Europe into the USA. were there not some kind of confluence of factors like those, which I think would not have happened so easily had there been work done in Africa? The kind of racism that is inherent in Christianity at this time would not have had free reign. It is my hope, it's a historical hope rather than a futuristic hope, that slavery could not have happened so easily were there value placed on the African peoples. And that value has got to be connected to their participation in history as meaningful people. And our history has been a largely sacred history. There's so much of Western history that's Christian history.
That was kind of my follow-up thought was, and it sounds so, as I say it, I feel like it sounds naive, but my thought was the fact that Christianity was a large part of the religion in Europe and going into the Americas, did that play a huge part in the attitude toward race, toward African American people of color that we are still seeing today? And it sounds like you've just said it is.
I think it is. And one of the things that happened too, and I'm not so, I don't want to be my own kind of naivety and say, oh, it would never have happened that way. It would just have had more contestation. The way would not have been as easy. But one of the things that happened too is that if you read, say, the book of Isaiah in a particular kind of way, you encounter Jewish triumphalism in it. You know, part of the messianic hope in Israel is a hope that all the nations are going to bring their trade to Jerusalem. You know, and Jerusalem is going to be the center of the earth, and people are going to worship their Yahweh, and we are going to just love Yahweh. That is a kind of triumphalism in and of itself, but I'm not denouncing it, because it's a kind of dreaming that a people who are repressed, who are experiencing all kinds of imperial oppressions, which they were, need to have in order to thrive from day to day. But what happens is when that triumphalism becomes part of the thinking, is adapted into and interpreted by people who simply think of themselves as entitled to that triumphalism, the triumphalism is disconnected from an oppressed people and put into the hands and hearts of a people who think they're entitled to subjugate others. So it's a very complicated story. And in that way, so that's another line of it. I'm putting it all very, very simply, but that's another line of it. But I'd like to think that if the sacredness of African folk and Asian folk and India comes into this as well. Because when I'm saying Asian here, I'm thinking Chinese, okay? But India comes into it as well. If the sacredness of those peoples had been part of our history, it would have to be different.
Amen. It's scary, such a small thing changed so much.
Mm-hmm. Want to make sure that Ellen has a chance to get in here.
Okay, let me.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't find my hand either. I don't know how you get into it.
Do you see an icon at the bottom of your screen called reactions? Do you have something like that?
Oh, I think I
just beside leave.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Okay.
Okay.
If you click on it, there's a thing.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank the reactions. Yes, I see. Thank you. I'll know that next time. I'm just curious. I've always wondered, what it would have been like if the East and West had not split, if the church had not made that split. I know, we often talk, the Catholic Church, the Western Catholic Church, has often quoted Augustine. St. Augustine was from Northern Africa. His mother, Monica, was Berber. She was a person of color, as was he. So I mean, it was a different church, the early church. Also, you had the different art. The cultures were different, and it was a wonderful diversity. You had Sophia Wisdom, which is in the Eastern Church. Theotokos, which is in the Eastern Church. There was a reverence of femaleness too there. But I think I don't know. It seemed like it became a power issue, didn't it? The papacies, yes, and that is what was such a shame. And that is, that seems to be what it was about. It was about power. Who is going to have power? And that has no place in something that calls itself after a being, Jesus Christ, who wanted nothing to do with power. So, that kind of power.
I can only say yes, yes, yes. And as you spoke to, you were sort of sparking my imagination to my memory. There is architecture in the East,
yes,
in the East, and some of it I don't know if it remains. There must be some remains of it, because there are people who recognize that there were baptismal fonts that were shaped like vaginas in churches, in order to show the rebirth, using the symbolism of a woman's vagina, something that we wouldn't even contemplate today. A woman's vagina. Oh my God. Yeah. But thanks for saying, yeah. It's such a complex history, though, Ellen. There's so many fracturing points, and one of the things what you've done is remind us that we inhabit only a particular version of that history. And it's not only the African stuff that I've talked about tonight, but our relationship to the Eastern Church. We don't talk about their history. It's as if we're the only Christianity. And one of the things I think might be changed, might be addressed, might take a few centuries to address it, is the evangelical notion that their formulaic way of doing Christianity is the true Christianity. It just doesn't work. Not right. So, thank you, Ellen.
Thank you again. I was curious about what you spoke a lot about the spread through Africa, and we're taught a lot. I'm sorry, my dog's very, but we're taught a lot about the missionaries in the 14th, 15th, 16th century that went to Africa and brought Christianity. Can you quiet her down? But I was curious about the spread through Asia. I mean, when we never really hear in history about Christianity in Asia. Even now, we don't hear much about Christianity in Asian countries. But it obviously spread that way. What happened to Christianity in Asian countries?
So I think India might have got. Somebody could correct me here on the Aryan invasion of India and its impact on any nascent form of the Jesus movement in India. But another thing that happened with China, I think, is that once we get to the 4th century and Christianity begins to gain orthodoxies and standardization, then a lot of the types of Christianity that went to China, for example, got lost as heresy. And I have an inkling that some of the forms of Christianity, the way they told stories, also got incorporated into some of the emergent Buddhist narratives also. But again, that is something to be explored. It's more than just an inkling. It's talking with people who come from those places and have a sense not only of formal history, but also of folkloric history, and can see and have seen some similarities between how they do folklore and how those early heretical Christian Jesus movements operated. And so it's what I'm saying is also is that there is just so much. You know, there was a time when I was formally studying, when I was doing theology, when I felt like just in terms of the narrative that I was learning, the standard biblical studies narrative, historical critical narrative, you know, what more is there to ask? What more is there to know? And then my door opened, and here was all this other stuff that we just have left behind.
Althea, this has just been such such an important presentation and conversation, and I really appreciated that you pointed to Nag Hammadi and the discovery in 1945 of those 52 texts within the codices. And because within that one discovery, you had so many voices from the first through third century that were in some way wrestling with this Jesus movement. And you had everything from the Gospel of Truth to Plato's Republic was even in there, to Thunder Perfect Mind, which the book argues could be the voice of Isis, you know, from Egypt. Yes. Have there been studies about the African roots of a lot of those Nag Hammadi texts? Do you know of anyone who's looked at the texts and situating them in their location, you know, down the Nile, close to Alexandria, and just such a incredible representation of the multiplicity of voices during that time?
The only person I could think of, and he doesn't quite hit it on the head the way you named it there, is a scholar, an Africana scholar, Salim Fariji. And he has a book. I'm looking at the book now. This is where I remember the title. I don't usually remember titles. But the book is The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. You know, and he's the one I know of who would come the closest to doing that kind of exploration. But his focus really eventually is not on Nag Hammadi. And so I don't think he takes the route you're asking about. I'm just taking a quick look through the book's index to see if he even names Nag Hammadi there. He does, on one page. But you see, John, I think about you know, when Randall Bailey and Fernando Segovia and Tatyang Beniliu and people like them talk about the Bible as a text of culture and a text in culture, then I think the enculturation of all these texts has got to be authentic too. You know, we can study them, we can even learn the languages. There's a woman, I think her name was Geraldine, I know her last name was Wright, who looked at linguistic families and thought that Hebrew and Hebrew, maybe Coptic, belonged, Hebrew Aramaic belonged to an Afro-Asiatic family. So when you're going to learn these languages, do you learn them as people of Europe and North America, even of Jamaica, or do you go to the countries where the cultures are still alive that speak these, so that you can actually understand better how the languages function and resonate inside a particular kind of culture? So it's all of that decentering that needs to happen, to be thankful for what we have gotten and to be thankful for where it has brought us, but to bring all this history of biblical studies into relationship with emergent studies in other cultures, so that we can have a chance of shaping new insights, new perceptions, new understandings, new knowledge.
Amen. A final word from Reverend Phyllis. We've hit the 9 o'clock time, but final question from Reverend Phyllis.
Many years ago, or many years after college, I was cleaning house, and it dawned on me out of the blue that when we studied world history, Africa was always lopped off from Egypt. When I studied the Nag Hammadi in ministerial school, again, I don't remember being consciously aware of where they came from. My question is, are you aware of any specific ritual from that time that has survived till today that we may do unconsciously? That is
not so much ritual, not so much ritual.
Maybe adopted, if you will.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last thing you said. Okay, yeah. Phyllis, you're muted.
Was there any specific ritual that you know that survived from that time to this day, even in a different form?
Baptism.
Okay.
Baptism is one. Ritual washing, ritual cleansing, that we know as baptism. That's the one I can think of. There is one. It's not really a ritual, but it's a practice that I learned of in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and I think it might be earlier than the 21st century, but certainly into the 20th century, was how to study the Bible. And it was done with how to memorize the Bible, and it was done with ritual rocking. So you rocked your body in a certain kind of rhythm as you learned the verses. No, that's not a sacred ritual practice, but I have a feeling that one has some antiquity to it. I'm better in the world of ideas, and one of the I think notions of sacrifice, notions of the ancestors, such as we find in the roll call of ancestors in Hebrews 12 or 13, that those have residue in our time. Larger issues, larger practices, I think that narrative reasoning is something that remains for us. It's not part of a formal ritual, but it's a way of thinking that remains for us, and it proliferates in the Bible. Bible is not very good at being propositional.
All right. Reverend Dr. Althea Spencer Miller, thank you so much. I can't emphasize enough just how important the information and the discussion that you led here tonight is to everything that we do as a community. And it's been an intellectual and spiritual feast. And I'm just so excited that there are so many that came out this evening to participate in it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any final word?
Oh yeah, final word. A good one would be amen, but but I think, you folk are some really good folk. The openness of your hearts, the magnanimity of your spirit. I think it's a kind of heart that God needs to reshape the world, because it's a kind of heart where someone like me can come in and say, I am anguished about what I'm sharing, and find companionship and people. And for me, that's God-given. That's God's gift. So thank you all for being that, and keep at it.
Thank you. Can we give Reverend Althea Spencer Miller a huge round of applause? You have truly blessed us tonight.
Thank you.
And just a quick announcement, our final class will take place a week from today in the Guild Room in person. If you prefer to join us virtually, there'll definitely be an online option, but we'd just love to see you next week, 7:30 in the Guild Room for our final session. Hopefully we will bring it all together, and it'll be so good to be in person with one another. So just thank you all so much for your contributions tonight. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Althea Spencer Miller.
Yes,
just unbelievable.
Thank
so
you.
great.
Good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, Althea.
Good
Night,
night,
Heather.
everyone.